The last confirmed signal from the Astor expedition arrived at 2:17 a.m. on September 14, 2016. It was not a distress call. There was no panic in the data stream, no rapid elevation loss, no erratic GPS drift, no emergency beacon activation. The transmission ended the same way thousands of routine altitude pings ended every climbing season: clean, sudden, and silent. On the monitoring screen inside the regional weather station near Karakol, the cursor froze at an elevation of 6,912 meters. Latitude and longitude locked. Oxygen flow telemetry flatlined seconds later. After that, nothing. At first, no one was alarmed. High-altitude signal loss was common on Mount Astor. The mountain sat in a dead zone between two unreliable satellite corridors, its ridges interfering with transmission at certain angles. Teams disappeared from the grid for hours, sometimes days, before reappearing lower down, tired but alive. But this time, the signal never returned. By mid-morning, meteorologists noticed something else. Wind speeds above 7,000 meters had spiked faster than forecast models predicted. Jet stream turbulence, normally hovering far above the summit, had dipped unexpectedly, compressing the atmospheric window climbers relied on to survive the upper slopes. Gusts exceeding 90 kilometers per hour were now ripping across the ridgeline, where the expedition's last signal had been recorded. At 11:43 a.m., a routine status request was sent to base camp. No reply. At 13:05, another attempt. Still nothing. By dusk, concern had spread quietly through the camp. Not panic, not yet, but a tightening awareness that something was off. 5 climbers were overdue. No descent confirmation, no radio traffic, no visual contact through binoculars trained on the upper ridge. Their tents were still standing. This detail would later trouble investigators more than anything else. When a Sherpa team was dispatched at first light the following morning, they found base camp exactly as the climbers had left it. Sleeping bags unrolled, half-melted snow in cooking pots, cameras charged but untouched. One pair of gloves lay beside a fuel canister, as if someone had removed them briefly and intended to come right back. They never did. There were no signs of a struggle, no avalanche debris, no blood, no broken gear. The fixed lines above Camp 3 remained intact, swaying gently in the wind like unused handrails leading nowhere. The mountain had not exploded, it had not collapsed, it had not announced itself, it had simply gone quiet. Mount Astor was not Everest. It lacked the fame, the traffic, the carefully engineered infrastructure of the world's tallest peak. Rising to just under 7,800 meters, it sat in a remote fold of the Tian Shan Range, straddling borders few climbers cared about and fewer governments actively monitored. There were no queues here, no ladders bolted into ice falls, no rescue helicopters waiting on standby. Astor was considered a clean mountain, less climbed, less forgiving, and largely indifferent to human ambition. Those who attempted it understood one thing clearly. Once above 6,500 meters, help did not come quickly, and sometimes not at all. The 5 climbers who vanished knew this. They had studied the reports, read the accident summaries, watched footage from earlier expeditions that showed frostbitten hands, oxygen-starved faces, and climbers moving with the slow, deliberate precision of people who understood that one mistake could end everything. They went anyway. In the days that followed, speculation filled the vacuum left by silence: a sudden storm, a fall into a hidden crevasse, a delayed descent forced by weather. Each theory appeared briefly, then dissolved under the weight of one unanswered question: why had no emergency signal been sent? Every climber carried one. Satellite beacons with a single purpose: press once, and rescue protocols would begin, however limited the odds. None of the 5 beacons had been activated. When search teams pushed higher, they encountered conditions that halted the effort entirely. Wind screamed across exposed faces. Visibility dropped to near zero. Temperatures plunged below -30 Celsius. Any attempt to reach the last known coordinates risked adding more bodies to the mountain. After 8 days, the official search was suspended. The incident was classified under a familiar, deeply unsatisfying designation used in high-altitude investigations: presumed fatalities, location unknown. No bodies were recovered. No definitive cause of death was established. The mountain kept what it had taken. For 4 years, Mount Astor stood unchanged. Snow erased footprints. Ice reshaped the upper ridges. The fixed lines were removed by later expeditions, leaving no physical trace that 5 people had ever been there at all, until one cold morning in October 2020, when a man walked out of the mountains alone. The investigation into the Astor expedition did not begin with the mountain. It began with paperwork. 5 names appeared repeatedly across permit applications, satellite registrations, and archived email chains. At first glance, they looked like a familiar combination seen in countless high-altitude cases: 1 dominant leader, 1 documentarian, 1 veteran, 1 inexperienced climber, and 1 medical professional. A balanced team on paper, a fragile one in reality. Ethan Cole was listed as expedition leader. At 34, he had already summited 3 peaks above 7,000 meters, none without incident. Reports from previous expeditions described him as competent but aggressive, a climber who treated turnaround times as suggestions rather than boundaries. In interviews conducted years earlier, Ethan spoke often about unfinished climbs and redemption routes, phrases psychologists later flagged as indicators of goal fixation. Friends described him as disciplined, driven, and deeply uncomfortable with stagnation. After a failed attempt on Mount Kalen 2 years earlier, where he had turned back less than 200 meters from the summit due to weather, Ethan's social media presence shifted noticeably. Posts became sparse, captions shorter. One message recovered from an email draft folder never sent reads simply, "I don't want another almost." To Ethan, Mount Astor was not just a peak, it was a correction. Mara Lynn joined the expedition under a different set of motivations. At 29, she was not a climber by trade but a filmmaker with a growing reputation for immersive survival documentaries. Her previous work focused on Arctic isolation and desert endurance, projects praised for their intimacy and criticized for placing subjects, and herself, too close to harm. In planning documents, Mara referred to Astor as a story the mountain hasn't allowed yet. Recovered footage from her hard drives revealed meticulous preparation, shot lists, narrative arcs, notes on slow deterioration and human decision-making under oxygen deprivation. Investigators later noted the language mirrored forensic terminology more than artistic description. Mara believed the mountain would reveal truth if observed long enough. Jonah Price was the oldest member of the team, at 41. A former military logistics officer turned high-altitude guide, Jonah had the most experience in extreme environments. He had survived an avalanche in Nepal in 2011 and lost 2 close friends on Denali in 2013. His personnel file from a guiding company described him as reliable, cautious, and increasingly withdrawn. In the years leading up to Astor, Jonah had taken fewer contracts. Financial records showed mounting debt, and a recent divorce finalized 6 months before the expedition. In a voicemail left for his brother days before departure, Jonah said, "I just need to feel useful again. Out there, things still make sense." Psychological consultants later identified this as a classic case of existential recalibration, the desire to return to an environment where rules were simple and consequences immediate. Liam Foster was the least experienced and the least scrutinized. At 26, he had climbed only 1 peak above 6,500 meters. His inclusion raised concerns among permit officials, but Ethan personally vouched for him. Emails between the two suggested a mentor-mentee relationship. Liam idolized Ethan, referring to him repeatedly as the guy who knows how to push past fear. Friends described Liam as enthusiastic, physically strong, and prone to minimizing risk. In one recorded interview conducted months earlier, he laughed when asked about death in the mountains. "If it happens, he said. At least it means you were really living." The comment would later be replayed in investigative hearings, not as evidence of recklessness, but of unformed risk comprehension, a mindset common in younger climbers who had not yet experienced irreversible loss. Noah Reed was different. At 38, he was a trauma physician with extensive wilderness medicine training. His role on the expedition was explicitly defined as medical oversight. He had assisted in 2 previous high-altitude rescues and had published a paper on delayed-onset cerebral edema at extreme altitude. Emails recovered from his account revealed hesitation. In one message to Mara, sent but later deleted, Noah wrote, "I'm not worried about the mountain, I'm worried about the decisions people make when they think they're running out of time." Despite this, he joined. Colleagues later testified that Noah struggled with a persistent sense of moral responsibility, an internal belief that if he didn't go, someone else might die without medical support. This compulsion, known in clinical psychology as responsibility overextension, often draws physicians into environments where their presence offers limited actual control. Individually, none of them were reckless. Together, they formed a system built on unspoken assumptions. The planning phase showed early cracks. Budget constraints reduced the number of reserve oxygen cylinders. Weather windows were calculated optimistically, relying on historical averages rather than real-time volatility models. Contingency plans existed on paper but lacked enforcement authority. Final decision-making rested almost entirely with Ethan. No one formally challenged this structure. Witnesses at base camp recalled subtle tension. Short conversations cut off mid-sentence. Disagreements resolved through silence rather than consensus. On the night before the final ascent, audio from Mara's camera captured Jonah asking about descent timing. Ethan responded, "Let's see how it feels up there." That phrase, "how it feels," would later become a focal point in the investigation. At extreme altitude, feeling is unreliable. As the team moved upward, physiological stress accumulated invisibly. Oxygen saturation levels dropped, judgment narrowed, reaction time slowed. These changes were expected. They were documented. They were also dangerously normalized. What no one accounted for was the compound effect of shared denial. When one climber hesitated, another compensated. When doubts surfaced, they were absorbed by momentum. Each individual assumed someone else would call for retreat if things truly became unsafe. No one did. By the time the team reached the elevation where the last signal was recorded, their capacity for objective assessment had already begun to erode. Brain scans of survivors from similar incidents show that hypoxia reduces the ability to recognize impairment itself. You don't know you're compromised because the system that would alert you is already failing. In forensic terms, this is known as anosognosia of altitude. It explains why no emergency beacon was activated. It explains why 5 experienced individuals continued upward into conditions they would have rejected at sea level. And it explains why, when the mountain demanded a decision, none of them fully understood the question. The warning signs did not arrive all at once. They emerged gradually, embedded in routine data that no one initially found alarming. Daily medical logs recovered from Noah Reed's encrypted tablet showed a predictable pattern during the first rotation. Oxygen saturation levels hovered between 82 and 88% at rest, dropping into the low 70 seconds during exertion. Heart rates were elevated but stable. Appetite suppression was noted across the team, particularly in Liam Foster and Mara Lind, who both logged skipped meals without complaint. In high-altitude medicine, these symptoms were not red flags. They were expected. What changed during the second rotation was not the numbers themselves, but the way the team responded to them. On September 11th, 3 days before the disappearance, Noah recorded a note that was never verbally escalated. Ethan Cole's SpO2 had dipped to 68% at 6,300 meters, lower than projected for his acclimatization profile. The drop coincided with reports of a persistent headache and intermittent visual narrowing, symptoms consistent with early hypoxic stress. Under standard protocols, this would have triggered at least a day of enforced rest. Instead, the team continued upward. Weather data from the same period shows a subtle but critical deviation. Wind shear models indicated instability forming above 7,200 meters, a pattern associated with rapid jet stream descent. These fluctuations were not visible to the naked eye and did not manifest as immediate storms. To climbers on the ground, conditions felt manageable. Clear skies, moderate winds, a false sense of control. This disconnect between perceived safety and atmospheric reality is a recurring feature in high-altitude fatality cases. Audio captured on Mara Lind's camera that afternoon documented a brief exchange while the team rested near Camp 3. Jonah Price suggested delaying the summit push by 12 hours to allow winds to settle. Ethan responded with a half-smile, saying, "If we wait, we lose the window." No one asked which window he meant. Later analysis showed there was no closing window. The weather would have stabilized if they had waited. But decision-making at altitude rarely incorporates future clarity. It prioritizes momentum. As oxygen deprivation increased, subtle behavioral shifts began to appear. Speech patterns slowed, jokes fell flat, pauses stretched longer between responses. In one clip, Liam asked a question and forgot it halfway through speaking. The moment passed without comment. Noah noticed these changes. His notes from that night mentioned flattened affect and delayed reaction, clinical language used to describe early cognitive impairment. He flagged the risk of compounded hypoxia if delays occurred during the summit attempt. Still, he did not intervene. Interviews conducted years later with surviving climbers from neighboring expeditions revealed a shared perception. The Astor team appeared calm, focused, and unusually quiet. One Sherpa described them as already very far inside themselves. Silence at altitude is not always peace. Often, it is neurological narrowing. By the evening of September 13th, the team prepared for the final ascent. Oxygen inventories were checked and found to be lower than projected due to increased consumption during earlier climbs. 2 reserve cylinders had been cached lower than planned to reduce load weight, a decision that reduced margin without immediate consequence. Medical protocols assumed uninterrupted forward movement. They did not account for delay. That night, the wind increased incrementally. Not enough to force retreat, but enough to slow progress. Fixed lines vibrated under tension. Headlamps flickered in gusts that carried ice crystals sharp enough to abrade exposed skin. At 22:40, NOAA recorded the last comprehensive medical entry. All climbers were conscious, all responsive. Ethan declined additional oxygen flow despite visible tremors in his hands. When asked why, he reportedly said, "Save it for later." There is no evidence anyone challenged that decision. The concept of later becomes abstract above 7,000 meters. Time stretches, compresses, and loses meaning. Climbers often believe they have more of it than they do. At 1:58 a.m., the team reached a narrow traverse just below the ridgeline. Progress slowed. According to reconstructed, pacing models, they were now more than 40 minutes behind optimal timing. This delay alone would not have been fatal at lower altitudes. Here it mattered. Standing still at extreme altitude accelerates heat loss and oxygen depletion. The body continues consuming resources without advancing toward safety. Muscles cool, judgment degrades. Small tasks require disproportionate effort. This is the point where most disasters begin. Data from the final satellite transmission suggests at least one climber experienced significant hypoxic confusion. The GPS path shows a brief deviation from the fixed route, followed by a correction. This movement pattern is consistent with spatial disorientation rather than terrain avoidance. What happened next cannot be reconstructed with certainty. No distress call was made, no beacon activated, no clear marker of catastrophe appears in the data. Investigators believe the team entered a state of collective impairment, a feedback loop where no single individual recognized the severity of the situation because all were compromised simultaneously. In forensic analysis, this is sometimes referred to as shared cognitive collapse. By the time the mountain demanded a decisive action, the capacity to make one had already eroded. The ascent after midnight unfolded without drama, which in retrospect made it more dangerous. Headlamp footage recovered later from a camera found 3 years afterward showed a steady rhythm of movement along the traverse. Boots biting into wind-packed snow. The metallic click of carabiners sliding along fixed rope. Breathing, heavy but controlled, filtered through oxygen masks that hissed softly in the dark. No shouting, no visible panic, no urgency. To an outside observer, it looked like a normal summit push. At extreme altitude, normal is deceptive. By 0:47 a.m., the team was moving slower than their projected pace, though still within what many climbers would consider acceptable margins. Wind gusts averaged 45 kilometers per hour, with intermittent spikes that forced brief pauses. During these pauses, the climbers leaned into the slope, resting their weight against the rope, heads bowed, conserving energy. Standing still above 7,000 meters is never neutral. It is a slow hemorrhage of heat and oxygen. Audio from Ethan Cole's chest-mounted recorder captured a moment at 1:12 a.m. where breathing patterns shifted. His inhalations became shorter, sharper. The sound was subtle, but forensic audio analysts later noted a change consistent with increased respiratory distress. At the same timestamp, GPS data showed a flattening of forward progress. They were stopped. The reason for the delay remains unclear. There is no evidence of another team blocking the route, no avalanche debris, no equipment failure visible in the limited footage available. Investigators believe the slowdown originated internally, likely tied to fatigue or cognitive hesitation rather than an external obstacle. At 1:29 a.m., the team resumed movement, but the formation had changed. Jonah Price, previously positioned second, had dropped back. Liam Foster moved ahead of him, his gait uneven but determined. Noah Reed remained near the rear, as he had throughout most of the climb, monitoring without overt interference. Mara Lynn's camera angle suggested she was drifting closer to Ethan than earlier, reducing spacing between climbers. This tightening of formation is common when conditions worsen. It is also dangerous. Reduced spacing limits visibility and reaction time. It makes individual errors contagious. At 1:58 a.m., the GPS deviation occurred. The path veered several meters off the established line, then corrected sharply. The correction was abrupt enough to suggest a sudden realization rather than gradual navigation. Someone had noticed they were off route and pulled back. Who noticed remains unknown. What is significant is that this deviation happened at a point where the slope steepened and exposure increased dramatically. A misstep here would not result in a short slide, it would mean a fall measured in hundreds of meters. Still, no distress signal was sent. At 2:06 a.m., oxygen telemetry from one unit dropped sharply, then stabilized. This pattern is consistent, with a regulator adjustment, or a brief interruption in flow. Under ideal conditions, such an issue would be addressed immediately and verbally confirmed among the team. No such confirmation appears in the audio. Instead, the soundscape grows quieter. Wind dominates the recordings. Breathing remains audible, but voices do not. There are no commands, no check-ins, no acknowledgements. This silence is not uncommon late in summit pushes, but combined with the other data, it suggests a narrowing of awareness. Hypoxia does not always cause panic. More often, it erodes initiative. By 2:14 a.m., the final minutes of usable data begin. The last clear visual frame shows Ethan's gloved hand gripping the fixed rope, knuckles flexing repeatedly as if testing strength. The camera shakes slightly, not from wind, but from muscular tremor. In the background, a headlamp beam swings erratically, briefly illuminating snow blowing sideways across the slope. At 2:17 a.m., the transmission ends. No fall is visible. No impact sound is captured. There is no sudden acceleration in GPS data that would indicate a slip or avalanche. The signal does not spike or fragment. It simply stops. This detail became the central problem for investigators. Most fatal accidents at altitude leave signatures. A fall creates motion. An avalanche creates noise and chaotic data. Equipment failure often triggers frantic attempts at correction. Here, there was none of that. The leading theory is not sudden catastrophe, but progressive collapse. Investigators believe the team encountered a convergence of factors within a narrow window. Increasing winds slowed progress. Delays increased oxygen consumption. Cognitive impairment deepened. Communication degraded. At some point, one climber likely experienced severe hypoxic confusion or loss of consciousness. In a tightly grouped formation on exposed terrain, a single incapacitated climber can destabilize others. If one person slumped against the rope, fell forward, or froze in place, the team would have been forced to stop. Prolonged stopping at that altitude accelerates decline for everyone involved. Decisions become harder. Physical strength drains rapidly. The ability to initiate emergency procedures diminishes. It is possible that by the time the situation was recognized as critical, no one retained the clarity needed to act. Why no beacon was activated remains the most haunting question. Activation requires intention, coordination, and a belief that rescue is still possible. Hypoxia undermines all three. Climbers suffering from severe oxygen deprivation often exhibit a phenomenon known as terminal calm, a state in which urgency dissolves and the mind retreats inward. They do not fight. They do not call for help. They simply stop. Search teams that later analyzed the terrain noted something else. The slope below the last known coordinates funnels into a series of gullies that feed into a massive ice field. A fall or controlled descent into this area would scatter bodies and equipment beyond recovery, quickly burying them under wind-driven snow. Even if the team attempted to descend, they may have done so in the wrong direction. By the time daylight came, the mountain showed no trace of them. No movement, no color against the white, no sound, just wind. The search began under the illusion that something could still be found. At first light on September 15th, 2 Sherpa teams ascended from base camp, following the same route the climbers had taken hours earlier. They moved cautiously, aware that every step upward placed them in the same physiological danger that had likely claimed the missing team. Their instructions were clear: advance only as conditions allowed, document everything, and retreat at the first sign that the mountain was no longer negotiable. By 8:20 a.m., the teams reached Camp 3. Nothing had changed. The tents stood exactly as they had been left, zippers half open, snow partially melted in cooking vessels, batteries fully charged. No sign that anyone had returned during the night. No footprints leading away from camp beyond those already logged during the ascent. Above Camp 3, the wind intensified. Visibility fluctuated between clear patches and near whiteout. Snow grains stung exposed skin like sand, driven sideways by gusts that made standing upright difficult. Even so, the teams pushed on, guided by GPS coordinates and memory. At approximately 6,850 meters, the first anomaly was documented. A fixed rope segment showed unusual tension marks, as if it had been weighted heavily for a prolonged period rather than momentarily clipped during ascent. The anchors themselves were intact, but the rope fibers showed abrasion inconsistent with normal passage. Investigators later suggested this could indicate someone had leaned, hung, or remained stationary against the line for an extended time. There were no crampon marks nearby to suggest movement away from the rope. This detail raised questions that could not be answered on the mountain. Higher up, the route narrowed, exposure increased, and the search slowed to a crawl. The Sherpas moved deliberately, scanning for color, shape, anything that did not belong to snow and rock. They found nothing. No bodies, no dropped packs, no oxygen bottles, no torn fabric caught on ice. It was as if 5 people had been erased. At 7,100 meters, the lead Sherpa radioed down that conditions were becoming unsafe. Winds were now exceeding 70 kilometers per hour, and clouds were building rapidly from the west. Continuing upward would place the search teams at risk of becoming casualties themselves. The decision to retreat was made reluctantly, but unanimously. From the air, the mountain offered no more answers. A helicopter reconnaissance flight attempted to survey the upper slopes 2 days later, pushing the limits of altitude and performance. The aircraft hovered briefly near the last known coordinates, the rotors struggling against thin air and unpredictable wind currents. Through binoculars and long-range cameras, observers scanned the ridgelines and gullies below. They saw nothing. Snowfields were unbroken, no debris trails, no dark shapes against the ice. The mountain appeared undisturbed, as if no human presence had ever existed there. This absence became the defining feature of the case. In most high-altitude fatalities, something remains. A boot, a cylinder, a body partially visible in melt season. Here, there was nothing to catalog, nothing to tag, nothing to retrieve. Without physical evidence, the investigation shifted to reconstruction. Back at base camp, equipment inventories were reviewed. Oxygen usage was recalculated. Timing models were rerun with updated weather data. Medical logs were analyzed frame by frame. Audio files were scrubbed for anomalies. GPS traces were layered against topographic maps. The conclusion that emerged was unsatisfying but consistent. The team had likely succumbed not to a single catastrophic event, but to a cascading failure of physiology and judgment. Hypoxia, fatigue, wind delay, and diminished oxygen reserves had converged in a narrow window. Once one climber faltered, the others may have been unable to respond effectively. But this theory did not explain everything. Why were no personal items found? Why did no one activate an emergency beacon, even as conditions deteriorated? Why did the rope show signs of prolonged loading, but no evidence of descent or fall nearby? These questions lingered. In high-altitude investigations, absence is not unusual. Mountains erase evidence quickly. Wind redistributes snow. Ice flows carry objects into crevasses miles away. What disappears one day may never reappear. Still, the total lack of trace unsettled even seasoned investigators. When the case file was officially closed 6 months later, it carried a familiar designation. Cause of death undetermined, presumed altitude-related. Families were notified. Death certificates were issued without locations. Memorial services were held without remains. The mountain kept its silence. Years passed. Mount Astor was climbed again, cautiously, by other teams. Routes shifted slightly. New fixed lines were placed, old ones were removed. The slope where the team vanished saw traffic, then seasons of emptiness, then traffic again. Nothing surfaced. Until October 2020, that was when a lone climber appeared at a ranger outpost in the valley below. Dehydrated, hypothermic, and carrying a pack that did not belong to him. Inside the pack were items that had been missing for 4 years. The man collapsed less than 20 meters from the ranger station before anyone realized he was there. At first, the officers on duty assumed he was another low-altitude trekker who had misjudged the weather. His clothes were torn, sun-bleached, and layered in a way that suggested improvisation rather than planning. His beard was matted with ice crystals. His lips were cracked to the point of bleeding. When he tried to speak, only a rasp came out, followed by a dry cough that bent him nearly in half. It was only when one ranger noticed the altitude rating on his boots that the situation changed. They were rated for above 7,000 meters. The man's name, once he could say it, was Jonah Price. Medical staff arrived within minutes. His core body temperature had dropped to 34 degrees Celsius. Severe dehydration was evident. His pulse was irregular, and his blood oxygen saturation at rest hovered dangerously low, even at valley altitude. He was placed on oxygen immediately and transported to the nearest medical facility capable of handling high-altitude trauma. In the ambulance, Jonah lost consciousness twice. By the time he stabilized, news of his survival had already begun spreading through climbing networks and investigative circles. One of 5 climbers missing since 2016 had returned alive, 4 years later, from a mountain that had never given up a single trace of them. Investigators arrived before his fever broke. They did not question him immediately. Protocol required stabilization first, but they documented everything. The condition of his clothing, the state of his boots, the scars visible on his hands where frostbite had healed improperly, leaving tissue stiff and discolored. His weight was recorded at 48 kilograms, nearly 20 below his listed expedition weight. The backpack he carried was secured as evidence. Inside, they found items that should not have existed: an oxygen regulator with a serial number matching equipment assigned to Ethan Cole, a camera battery stamped with Mara Lynn's initials, a torn section of rope consistent with fixed-line material used on Mount Astor in 2016, and at the bottom of the pack, wrapped in layers of cloth, a satellite beacon. It had never been activated. The presence of these objects raised immediate red flags. Not because Jonah had them, but because they had survived with him. Equipment abandoned at extreme altitude rarely remains intact. Snow, wind, and ice destroy or bury almost everything within a season or two. That these items had been preserved suggested prolonged shelter or controlled movement, not exposure. When Jonah was finally cleared for questioning, the room was kept quiet. No uniforms, no recording equipment visible, though audio was captured discreetly. Investigators wanted him calm, cooperative, lucid. They asked simple questions first: his name, the date, the location. He answered the first 2 correctly. The third took longer. When asked where he had been for the past 4 years, Jonah closed his eyes and did not speak for nearly 30 seconds. His breathing changed, shallow, irregular. The attending physician signaled for a pause, but Jonah shook his head. He said he had been on the mountain. Pressed for clarification, he added, "Not the way you're thinking." This answer would appear repeatedly in transcripts over the weeks that followed. According to Jonah, the team did not fall. There was no avalanche, no single moment of disaster. Instead, he described something slower, quieter, and more difficult to define. He said Ethan stopped first, not collapsed, not slipped, just stopped moving. They were clipped into the fixed rope, standing on the slope, when Ethan leaned forward slightly and rested his helmet against the line. Jonah assumed it was fatigue and waited for him to adjust. He never did. Mara tried to speak to him, but he didn't respond. When she reached out, Ethan's body swayed, then settled again, held upright by the rope in his harness. Jonah said that was when he realized something was wrong, but he couldn't explain why he didn't act immediately. He described his thoughts as thick, like moving through water. He knew something needed to be done, but every option felt distant, abstract, unreal. The idea of activating the beacon occurred to him, but it felt unnecessary, almost inappropriate, as if it belonged to another situation entirely. This description aligned with known hypoxic cognitive distortion. What followed, according to Jonah, was a gradual unraveling. Liam lost coordination next. He kept fumbling his carabiner, unclipping and reclipping the same section of rope repeatedly. Noah tried to intervene, but his movements were slow, exaggerated. Mara began crying quietly inside her mask, though she could not later recall why. At some point, Jonah said, the wind grew louder, or perhaps his awareness narrowed until it seemed that way. He remembered thinking that the mountain was closing in, not physically, but mentally. Then there were gaps, hours he could not account for. Moments he remembered only as sensations rather than events: cold, pressure, the feeling of leaning against something solid while everything else faded. When he came back to awareness, he was alone. He did not know how much time had passed. The sky was lighter, suggesting morning or late afternoon. He was lower on the slope, no longer clipped to the fixed line. One glove was missing. His oxygen mask was gone. He said he did not remember descending. This statement unsettled investigators more than anything else. Descending from above 7,000 meters without oxygen, without clear memory, and without fatal injury is statistically improbable. Survival under those conditions would require sustained movement, decision-making, and physical effort far beyond what hypoxia normally allows. Yet Jonah was alive. When asked how he survived the following years, Jonah's answers became less concrete. He spoke of finding shelter in broken ice and places where the wind didn't reach. He described rationing oxygen he somehow still had, though the math did not align with known consumption rates. He insisted he was not alone the entire time. When pressed, he said, "They were there, just not the way you'd expect." At that point, the interview was stopped. Psychological evaluation was ordered immediately. The first formal interview with Jonah Price lasted 4 hours and produced more questions than answers. It was conducted 3 days after his admission, once dehydration had been corrected and his oxygen saturation stabilized. He was alert, oriented, and cooperative. Neurological scans showed no acute injury. Cognitive testing placed him within normal ranges for memory recall, attention, and language. On paper, he was mentally intact. That was the problem. Investigators expected confusion, fragmentation, trauma-induced gaps. What they encountered instead was coherence layered over contradiction. Jonah spoke calmly, answered directly, and rarely asked for clarification. Yet when his statements were cross-checked against hard data, the alignment collapsed. The first discrepancy involved timing. According to Jonah, Ethan stopped moving shortly after midnight, during what he described as a routine pause. But satellite telemetry showed the team was still progressing normally until nearly 2 a.m. No prolonged stop was recorded at the time Jonah described. Oxygen flow rates and GPS movement indicated steady ascent. When this inconsistency was presented to him, Jonah did not argue. He nodded slowly and said, "That's what the numbers say." He did not say the numbers were wrong. Pressed further, he admitted that his sense of time on the mountain had been unreliable. He described minutes that felt like hours and stretches of climbing he could not recall at all. This was consistent with hypoxic temporal distortion, but did not fully explain the specificity of his original account. The second discrepancy involved location. Jonah claimed he regained awareness well below the ridgeline, in an area where the slope widened and the wind lessened. He described a shallow ice depression that offered shelter, and said he remained there for a long time. However, topographic analysis showed no such feature along the descent path consistent with his description. When shown satellite imagery and elevation profiles, Jonah became visibly unsettled. He stared at the images for several seconds before saying quietly, "That's not where I was." Asked to clarify, he could not. The third discrepancy was physical. Jonah's survival presented a statistical anomaly. Even under optimal conditions, unassisted descent from above 7,000 meters without supplemental oxygen carries a fatality risk exceeding 90%. Jonah had no memory of sustained descent, no recollection of route finding, and no explanation for how he avoided the same fate as the others. Medical examination found extensive frostbite scarring on his hands and feet, consistent with prolonged cold exposure, but no injuries consistent with a major fall. His muscles showed signs of extreme atrophy, suggesting weeks or months of limited movement. Yet 4 years had passed. When asked directly how long he believed he had been on the mountain, Jonah hesitated. "I don't think it was 4 years," he said. This answer shifted the tone of the investigation. Psychological evaluation was expanded. Trauma specialists, high-altitude physicians, and forensic psychologists were consulted. They reviewed interview footage, analyzed speech patterns, and compared his statements against known cases of hypoxia-induced psychosis. Several patterns emerged. Jonah demonstrated a phenomenon known as confabulation, the unconscious creation of memories to fill gaps. Unlike deliberate fabrication, confabulation is experienced by the subject as real. The individual is not lying. They are reconstructing reality with incomplete data. However, Jonah's confabulation did not follow expected patterns. Most hypoxic survivors fabricate brief sequences, distorted moments, or emotionally charged fragments. Jonah constructed extended narratives with internal logic and continuity. His descriptions of the others, Ethan, Mara, Liam, Noah, remained consistent across interviews. Their positions, expressions, and actions did not change. What did change was context. In one interview, Jonah described Mara sitting beside him in silence for hours, her oxygen mask fogged, her eyes open but unfocused. In another, he said she stood nearby, clipped to the rope, swaying slightly as the wind pushed against her. When asked which was correct, he answered, "Both." Investigators noted that Jonah never described seeing any of the others fall or die. He described them becoming still, quiet, and distant. He spoke of them as present but unreachable, as if separated by something he could not cross. This language raised concerns about dissociative coping mechanisms. When questioned about the beacon found in his pack, Jonah showed genuine surprise. He insisted he did not remember taking it. He acknowledged that activating it would have been the correct decision, but said the thought never felt urgent. It didn't feel like an emergency, he said. It felt like the mountain had already decided. This phrasing appeared repeatedly. Review of audio logs recovered from his equipment revealed something unsettling. In the final minutes before signal loss, there were faint vocalizations not previously identified as speech. When isolated and slowed, analysts determined the sounds were human but distorted by wind and equipment noise. They matched Jonah's voice. The words, though indistinct, were consistent across multiple filters. He appeared to be repeating a phrase, "Stay." When confronted with this evidence, Jonah showed no visible reaction. He listened, then closed his eyes. "I remember saying that," he said. "I just don't know who I was saying it to." The investigation reached a quiet impasse. Jonah was not delusional in any diagnosable sense. He did not exhibit psychosis, hallucinations, or paranoid ideation. His memory deficits were real but selective. His emotional responses were muted but appropriate. And yet, his account could not be reconciled with physical reality. Investigators were left with two possibilities. Either Jonah's mind had constructed an elaborate survival narrative to protect him from unbearable trauma, or critical events occurred on the mountain that left no recoverable evidence and no surviving witnesses. Neither explanation offered closure. The case was reopened under a new designation, recovered survivor, inconclusive event. But privately, many involved admitted something else. The mountain had given one person back, and whatever happened up there, it had not let him go completely. The backpack became the most important witness in the case. It was examined in a controlled forensic environment 3 weeks after Jonah Price's return, once contamination risks were minimized and chain of custody procedures completed. Investigators approached it the way they would a crime scene, because in many ways, that is exactly what it was. Unlike human memory, the pack did not reinterpret events, it preserved them. The exterior told the first story. The fabric showed extreme ultraviolet degradation, consistent with prolonged high-altitude exposure over multiple seasons. Stitching had stiffened, and certain nylon fibers had become brittle enough to snap under minimal pressure. This degree of damage suggested years of exposure above 6,000 meters, not weeks or months. Yet the pack's structural integrity remained intact, implying it had not been subjected to repeated burial and movement by avalanches. It had stayed mostly in one place. Inside, the arrangement of items was deliberate. The oxygen regulator assigned to Ethan Cole showed evidence of use well beyond its logged operational window. Internal wear patterns indicated repeated attachment and detachment cycles, far exceeding what would be expected from a single summit push. Even more troubling, microscopic ice scoring inside the valve assembly suggested it had been operated at temperatures lower than those recorded during the 2016 season. That meant it had been used later. The camera battery marked with Mara Lynn's initials was next. Its casing bore fine scratches consistent with handling by gloved hands, but the battery itself still held a residual charge. Lithium-ion cells degrade rapidly in extreme cold. After 4 years, especially without controlled storage, the battery should have been inert. It was not. When engineers attempted to draw power, the battery produced voltage for several seconds before failing. That brief output implied intermittent charging or thermal protection at some point during the intervening years. There was no explanation for how that could have occurred. The torn rope section raised further questions. Fiber analysis confirmed it matched fixed-line material used on Mount Astor in 2016. The break was not clean. It showed tension failure combined with abrasion, as if it had been repeatedly weighted and rubbed against ice or rock before finally tearing. This was not the signature of a fall. It was the signature of use. Perhaps the most disturbing item was the satellite beacon. Serial records confirmed it belonged to Noah Reed. The casing showed wear patterns consistent with long-term handling. The activation button was intact, free of ice damage, and functional. There was no mechanical reason it could not have been used. Digital analysis of the beacon's internal clock revealed something investigators had not expected. While no distress signal had ever been sent, the device had been powered on and off multiple times over a period extending years beyond the disappearance date. Someone had interacted with it. When Jonah was confronted with this information, his reaction was subtle but unmistakable. His breathing quickened, his hands tightened around the arms of the chair. He asked to see the beacon. When it was placed in front of him, he did not touch it. "I thought it stopped working," he said. Pressed on when he last remembered using it, Jonah gave an answer that shifted the investigation into uncomfortable territory. "I remember turning it on," he said. "I don't remember why I turned it off." Investigators reviewed environmental data again. There was no evidence of long-term habitable shelter on the mountain. No caves, no structures, no known ice formations stable enough to protect a human for multiple years. Snow accumulation and ice flow models showed that any exposed object would be buried or destroyed within a single season, yet the pack and its contents contradicted that reality. Attention turned to Jonah's physical condition once more. Muscle atrophy patterns suggested prolonged inactivity punctuated by periods of movement. His vitamin deficiencies were severe but uneven, consistent with irregular access to food rather than total starvation. Tissue samples from frostbite scars indicated repeated freeze-thaw cycles over extended time frames. This was not the physiology of someone who had simply wandered downhill and survived by chance. It suggested endurance. One forensic specialist summarized it bluntly in their report. The subject appears to have lived at altitude longer than is considered survivable by current medical understanding. That sentence was later removed from the final version. As the investigation deepened, a final anomaly emerged. Embedded in the pack's lining was a small scrap of fabric, almost overlooked. It was a fragment of down suit insulation, stained dark with age. DNA analysis matched it to Liam Foster. The edges were heat-sealed, not torn, not ripped, melted. There is no natural heat source on Mount Astor capable of producing that effect at altitude. When Jonah was shown the photograph of the fabric under magnification, he turned away. He said he did not remember fire, but he remembered warmth. He described it carefully, choosing his words with visible effort. He said there were moments when the cold receded, not completely, but enough to make thinking easier, enough to rest without shaking, enough to sleep. Investigators asked him where this warmth came from. Jonah did not answer. The case notes from that day end abruptly, replaced by a brief addendum written weeks later. It stated that further questioning had been suspended due to concerns about Jonah's psychological stability and the diminishing likelihood of obtaining verifiable information. Privately, several investigators disagreed with that decision. They believed the investigation had reached the edge of something important. The evidence did not suggest hallucination. It suggested survival under conditions where survival should not have been possible. And whatever made that survival possible was not documented in any report, chart, or precedent the team could find. What Jonah Price did not say became as important as what he did. By the fourth week of interviews, investigators had accumulated more than 18 hours of recorded testimony. Much of it overlapped. Certain phrases repeated with near-identical wording, as if rehearsed unconsciously. Others appeared once and were never returned to, even when prompted. When analysts mapped Jonah's statements chronologically, a pattern emerged. His narrative functioned well at the edges, before the disappearance and after his return. The center of the timeline, the period that should have contained the most detail, was compressed into fragments, not blank. Compressed. This distinction mattered. Blank memory suggested loss. Compression suggested avoidance. A forensic psychologist assigned to the case noted that Jonah exhibited what is sometimes called selective narrative collapse. The mind preserves peripheral structure while destabilizing the core event, not because it cannot remember, but because remembering threatens psychological survival. In Jonah's case, the threat did not appear to be fear. It appeared to be responsibility. During one closed-session interview, not entered into the official transcript, Jonah was asked a direct question that had been avoided until then. Do you believe the others could have survived if you had acted differently? The question was delivered neutrally. No accusation, no emotional framing. Jonah did not respond immediately. His gaze dropped to the floor. His breathing slowed. The room remained silent for nearly a full minute before he spoke. "Yes," he said. That single word changed the trajectory of the investigation. Asked to elaborate, Jonah did not describe specific actions. He did not say he should have activated the beacon, or forced a descent, or separated from the group. Instead, he spoke in abstractions. He said he should have broken the stillness. He explained that there was a moment, one he could not place precisely in time, when everything paused. Not physically, but mentally. The team was no longer climbing, but they had not yet failed. He said that moment felt fragile, like something that could go in either direction, and he did nothing. Investigators asked what he meant by stillness. Jonah struggled to answer. He said the mountain felt quiet in a way that was not normal. The wind was present, but distant. The pressure in his head eased briefly. He described a sense of suspension, as if the climb had stopped progressing forward or backward. In that moment, he said, he felt certain they would not be rescued. Not because rescue was impossible, but because it was irrelevant. This belief did not arise from panic or despair. It arrived calmly, fully formed, and unquestioned. The idea that help might come felt absurd, like calling for assistance in a dream. This belief is not consistent with hypoxia alone. While oxygen deprivation impairs judgment, it does not typically produce complex existential certainty. That kind of conviction requires coherence. The psychologist noted that Jonah's language shifted noticeably when discussing this period. His sentences became simpler. His tone flattened. Emotional markers disappeared. It was as if he were describing an environment rather than an experience. In a later interview, Jonah was shown the final image recovered from Mara Lynn's camera. It depicted a section of slope partially illuminated by headlamp light. Snow was blowing sideways across the frame. At the edge of visibility, a human shape could be seen, upright, clipped to the rope. The image was grainy. The figure's face was indistinct. Jonah identified the figure immediately. "That's Ethan," he said. When asked how he knew, Jonah replied, "Because he's still waiting." The investigators did not ask what he meant by that. Instead, they asked a different question. Waiting for what? Jonah closed his eyes. "For someone to decide," he said. This answer never appeared in the final report. As the investigation drew toward its administrative end, pressure mounted to resolve the case within existing frameworks. Legal counsel warned against speculative conclusions. Medical consultants emphasized the limits of survivability and the unreliability of memory under extreme trauma. A decision was made to narrow the scope. Jonah's testimony was officially categorized as unreliable beyond the moment of disappearance. The physical evidence was attributed to anomalous preservation under rare environmental conditions. The powered-on beacon events were labeled unexplained, but non-indicative. Language was softened. Certainty was avoided. In the final case summary, one sentence stood out for its careful neutrality. No evidence was found to suggest prolonged survival of the missing climbers beyond the initial incident. Privately, several members of the investigative team objected. Their concern was not that Jonah was lying. It was that he was telling the truth in a way the system could not accommodate. Before the case file was sealed, Jonah was asked one final question, off the record. "Why do you think you survived?" He answered without hesitation. "Because I left," he said. Asked to clarify, he added something that caused the interviewer to stop writing. "I don't mean I descended," Jonah said. "I mean I stopped staying." The interview ended there. Jonah Price was released from medical supervision 2 weeks later. He declined all media requests. He did not return to climbing. He moved inland, far from mountains, and took a job that kept him at sea level. According to follow-up welfare checks, he slept poorly. He avoided silence, and he never spoke about Mount Astor again. The case was closed, but the mountain was not. The final report on the Astor expedition was signed, stamped, and archived on February 3, 2021. It ran 72 pages long and concluded, in carefully neutral language, that 5 climbers had perished due to altitude-related causes during a summit attempt in September 2016. It cited hypoxia, environmental exposure, and delayed response as contributing factors. It acknowledged the recovery of one survivor but emphasized that his testimony could not be corroborated by physical evidence. The report closed the case. Officially, nothing more remained to be said. Unofficially, several investigators continued to revisit it in private. Not out of professional obligation, but because certain details refused to settle into place. They returned to the same questions over and over, never finding answers that felt complete. Why did the rope show signs of prolonged loading without evidence of descent? Why had equipment been used years after the disappearance? Why did the beacon register power cycles without ever transmitting a signal? And why, in every model that simulated a single climber surviving alone, did Jonah Price's outcome remain an outlier? Mount Astor did not offer explanations. In the summers that followed, climbers reported strange but inconclusive observations. A length of old rope half buried in ice, later dismissed as debris from another route. A helmet-shaped shadow glimpsed at dusk, gone when approached. Audio interference on radios near the ridgeline, written off as atmospheric distortion. None of it rose to the level of evidence, but none of it fully went away. In 2023, a multinational expedition attempted a new line on the mountain's western face. Their ascent was successful, their descent uneventful. In their post-climb debrief, one Sherpa mentioned something in passing, almost as an afterthought. He said there was a place, just below the old route, where the wind behaved strangely. He said the snow there never quite settled, and he said that when the team paused briefly to rest, no one spoke, because it felt like they were interrupting something. The comment was not included in the official log. Jonah Price never returned to the mountains. According to public records, he lived quietly. He avoided interviews. He declined invitations to speak about survival, resilience, or trauma. He changed addresses twice, always remaining at low altitude. He was described by neighbors as polite, distant, and meticulous. He slept with lights on. In a final welfare check conducted 5 years after his return, the attending physician noted that Jonah showed no signs of active psychosis or delusion. His mental state was stable. His memories of the expedition remained fragmented, but unchanged. When asked if he still thought about Mount Astor, Jonah answered honestly. "Only when it's quiet," he said. The physician asked what he meant. Jonah paused, then said, "The mountain wasn't loud when it happened. There was no follow-up question. Mountains do not need witnesses. They do not need to explain themselves. They do not remember the dead the way humans do. They only keep what is given to them, and sometimes they return something incomplete. The case of the Astor expedition remains officially closed. 5 climbers went up, 1 came back, and somewhere above 7,000 meters, on a slope where the wind never fully rests, the mountain continues to hold the rest of the story."